Hello and welcome, friends, to another episode of the Three Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. I am Sam Levy with the CCO Campus Ministry, transforming college students to transform the world. And I'm here, as always, with the one and only Byron Borger of Hearts and Minds Books. Byron, how are you?
I am good today. We're recording this in the morning. Sometimes we do them in the late afternoons, but it's fun to see you early this morning. And we're going to talk about three really important books.
Yeah, I am excited for this episode, saddened by the event that inspired it, which was the death of a fantastic, prolific, and beloved biblical scholar, Hebrew Bible scholar, Walter Brueggemann. Byron, tell us about your experience with Brueggemann's work.
Oh, my goodness. Well, we could talk a long time about our engagement with Brueggemann, the history of Brueggemann. I've met him more than once, a bunch of times. He called me by name more than once, remembered me, and we had a lot of good times together, including a long weekend where he wrote all kinds of scribbled stuff on the whiteboard, on flip charts. And at the end, everybody was leaving. We're packing up the books, and we realized nobody had taken these, so we tore them down and brought them home. And my daughters unrolled them and used them in Sunday school classes already, although they're hard to make sense of because they're so scribbly. But man, he was an important person to us. He was a dear person. I'll just tell one quick story. We were once selling books at a big soiree in Washington, D.C. It was a Bread for the World fundraising banquet, and he was the main preacher, and there were a lot of people there, including some bigwigs, the Kennedy family and some people. And I'm selling books in the back. I had underestimated how this event was going to go down, so I was by myself. I never should have done it by myself, but there I was, big crowds. I was setting things up. I had some bookends, metal bookends, and I cut my hand really badly. And I was bleeding, and I wrapped tissue around it, and I'm holding it up to stop the blood, and the blood's dripping down on the books. People didn't care. They just wanted their darn books. Nobody said anything. I'm bleeding on their books. Until one woman who was a nurse said, "You need to get stitches on the thing. That's bad." And I'm like, "Damn, I've got a line of people here." So she ran out to a CVS or something, Rite Aid, came back and stitched, put a little bandage on my hand and stuff. And I kept going. Well, at the end, Brueggemann had preached up a storm on this theme of abundance that he does sometimes versus scarcity. It was a beautiful talk. People were fired up. And then the hosts were taking him to some other fancy after party. And he said, "No, wait a minute. I got to go thank that guy in the back." So he comes all the way to the back, all through this big ballroom, just to shake my hand. And we had known each other, and he knew who I was. So he wanted to say hello, but he also wanted to thank me. It was just like some authors don't do that at all. He wanted to thank me. So I just thought that was generous, that even while they're tugging at his sleeve to take him to the Kennedys, he wanted to come and say hi to me. Well, he noticed my hand, and he's like, "Hey, man, you hurt yourself. Are you okay? Can I get you anything?" And I'm thinking, of all the people here, it's the famous speaker that cared about me and that cared about my bloody hand. But I appreciated that about Walter. He was just a decent guy. His students loved him. He was legendary as he taught at Columbia, a Presbyterian seminary in the Deep South, in Decatur, Georgia. He was legendary for his prayers. He would pray before every class, and it was like poetry. And in fact, they published a bunch of his prayers now, and it is like poetry. Passionate, long prayers based on the biblical text or whatever was happening that day. So he was a sort of progressive, United Church of Christ Bible scholar that forged new ground for people in the 60s and 70s, really taking seriously the biblical text and the shape of the canon. As you may know, or those that listening may follow some of this, back in the 50s and the 60s, when he was coming of age, he taught at a little reformed, what became UCC seminary, where the Niebers were the trustees, Ronald Niebuhr. So he was in some pretty hefty intellectual categories and was studying sociology at the time as well. There's a great biography of him written by a guy from here in Elizabethtown, PA, about his life story that's well worth reading. But Brueggemann came out of this experience in mainline Protestantism, where many biblical scholars, not so much evangelical and fundamentalist, but biblical scholars of the mainline sort, and the most famous ones out of Germany and stuff, were what we might want to call critical scholars. They would argue about who wrote the letter and when it was dated and these kind of questions. And therefore, what led to who edited it in, and did this come from other streams of thought? And you could tell from the writing style that this was maybe added in later. That may be true. Brueggemann probably believed a lot of that stuff. But he says at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. What we're given in God's word is the shape of the canon. It is what it is. And so we just have to preach it the way it is. And so why spend so much time in the critical discourse sort of tearing the Bible apart without proclaiming it with passion for the people of God? And so he wrote a book in the 70s called The Prophetic Imagination. And that'll be the first one I'll mention of my three. The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. And it literally changed the face of biblical conversations within mainline denominational circles, away from the criticism towards the lived experience of prophets, the people of God, as they were going into exile, as they were feeling oppressed by the experience. I mean, he really put yourself in the position of oppressed people under Pharaoh and let my people go, or the fear going into exile, which he would often say after 9/11 was sort of like the 9/11 experience of the Bible. You know, just imagine being in Manhattan with the city destroyed and the key temple of the building of the neighborhood destroyed. I mean, you know, when they burned the temple and destroyed Jerusalem and carted the people off to exile, this was just huge. And I think in my evangelical growing up, we didn't hear much about that, the theme of going into exile, because we didn't read the prophets that much. And so to place the prophets and then even the Psalms in sort of before exile or after exile, in the prophetic imagination, he would talk about how sort of the theme of the prophets as they were leading people into exile, preparing people for this judgment, was almost to talk truth to people who were in denial. They couldn't believe, because they believed in the doxology of Zion, the glory of Zion. Nothing wrong could ever come to God's people. We're God's chosen people. So this kind of nationalistic hubris, and some of the Psalms he thinks are filled with that, like the Star Spangled Banner, and maybe needs to be deconstructed a little because they were poems of the state, and the prophets were saying, no, you can't press Zion like you may think you're Zion or have the covenant of God, but that doesn't mean you can rip off the poor and get away with it. And sure enough, he was speaking truth, people in denial. Well, then after the horror of exile, after 9/11, after they're in Babylon, and they had new hope to return, he said, now we have to preach hope to people in despair because they've given up. Could God ever be with us? We blew it, and now we're in exile. We're being punished. Will there ever be a second chance? And he says, yes, God's steadfast love and faithfulness to his own covenant. You hope at a time of despair. So truth looking into denial and hope in a time of despair is sort of the theme of this book. What the prophetic imagination does, he looks at what kind of imagination the prophets would need to have to do what they did. This audacious claim that God would judge Israel, audacious. Or that God could give new hope after exile, audacious. Where in the world could this come from? Whether it was Moses confronting Pharaoh, or whether it was Jeremiah weeping over the city, or whether it was Jesus himself who stood in the prophetic tradition with John the Baptist pointing his finger to him, he looks at those characters and he said the thing they have in common is they wept. They had pathos. They had passion and broken hearts for what was going on amongst the people of God, whether it was the injustice of the poor or whether it was the violation of covenant, the abuse of Sabbath, the dishonoring of God. The prophets were subversive because they were full of pathos. You think of the word where you don't have any pathos, it's apathy, right? And so it's sort of pathos versus apathy. You have to care deeply, to shed tears, and only then will you be able to sort of have the spirit-filled power to speak truth to people that don't want to hear it, or to give people hope who don't feel they could muster up enough belief to have the audacity of having hope. So it seems to me that this book, although it's dense, I probably read it 3 times before I understood it. Came out in a 40th anniversary edition a good number of years ago. It was written, as we said, in the 70s. But it's sort of this alternative community of the people that followed Moses, who confronted what he calls royal consciousness, countercultural voice of the prophets, were against the empire's consciousness that captured people's imaginations. And so what you need to do is set free people's hearts and minds to be able to imagine that judgment is real, or imagine that hope is possible. And so the imagination piece is that teaching good doctrine or telling people to follow the law isn't enough. You need to somehow have a pathos-filled, passionate invitation to this new kind of imagination. And so it is not to be considered merely politically left-wing. Some people use the prophets because they talk about against justice. They talk about caring for immigrants. They talk about beating swords into plowshares. So we who care about social justice will often quote, Micah 6:8 or something, and we use the prophets to bolster our sort of critique of the establishment. And he says, no, it's not primarily about politics. It's not left or right. Everybody's got a captive imagination to the culture at large, and we have to somehow break free from the kind of consumerism that has infected both the left and the right, and set free a new kind of imagination that would be prophetic in our day and age. Well, that's how I'm sort of describing the prophetic imagination. Sam, I know it's an important book for you. You've studied Brueggemann stuff over the years. Have you found this book to be helpful? I don't want to put you in the spot, but what do you think? Am I saying it right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that was a fantastic summary and a book that's difficult to summarize because it's not a large book, but there's so much in it that is not only so powerful for its time when it was written, published in 1978, but it's maybe a little disheartening, but also really amazing how prescient and powerful it remains in this moment. I was flipping through it this morning and looking at some of the quotes I had underlined and pages I had dog-eared, and so much feels like it could have been written yesterday. I can't help but, maybe this is a little bit cheesy, but honestly, the story you told about cutting your hand at his event seems like a kind of a parable of some of these themes of prophetic imagination and Brueggemann's work in general. Of there was a wound, there was pain that was suffered that was being ignored by the majority of people because to pay attention to it would disrupt the marketplace. And here comes the prophet who has eyes to see what is happening and be attentive to the pain. And seek restoration for the pain and provide hope, to have the imagination.
Oh, Sam, you have just absolutely transformed how I understood that story, because in my life, it was just, he was kind to me. He was an okay guy and he showed up and we're friends. But man, you're exactly right. That is a Brueggemann-esque insight about the untended wound that we're afraid to mention and name because it might disrupt the marketplace. That is exactly like what Brueggemann would say about these sorts of things, naming stuff as a poet might. One of his books on preaching is called Finally Comes the Poet. He often says stuff about the Psalms. He's written 3 or 4 commentaries on the Psalms, and we could do just 3 books on Brueggemann's 3 best books on the Psalms. But he would just say sometimes, so it's just a poem. But are you willing to stake your life on it? I know guys back when I was growing up, even being trained by the CCO, I know some people that would go to the wall arguing that every jot and tittle of the Bible is absolutely inerrant and just as it was meant to be. But they actually, in that argument, left me sort of dry with scholarly discussions about grammar points and translations and sort of rigorous, scholarly, rationalistic logic. And they never invited me to stake my life on it. They just argued about how true it was. And then Brueggemann comes along and says, I don't know, it's just a poem. But you just stick your very life on it with pathos. So I don't know what he says about the Bible when he says stuff. Sometimes it's sort of tongue-in-cheek when it's just a poem. Half Isaiah's a poem, half of Jeremiah's a poem. It's just a poet. But then he exegetes it and invites you to believe it with all your guts. So anyway, this is an amazingly energizing book. Here's what I would also recommend people. It's a little dense at times. He uses language and a cadence of language. It's a little unusual. I would listen to him online. Google some sermons, Google some talks, get into his cadence, his vocabulary, how he uses words. And then once you go to read it, you can hear his sort of Southern drawl and his spectacular vocabulary and his sociological language. And I think you'll get more out of the book once you hear him speaking it. I can't tell you how many people I've seen on Facebook saying this book transformed their life. From major biblical scholars like Brent Strawn, or like activists like Shane Claiborne, older guys who are in 90s, to young guys like Shane that are coming on now as leaders, William Barber, the African-American preacher. Many people said this is a book that changed their life. And so I can't commend it enough. One little story, by the way, just for us, in the CCO, many CCO staff are listening to this, our campus ministry organization. One of our trainers in teaching us a Christian sort of transforming vision and worldview was Brian Walsh. And in the transforming vision, which we still use sometimes, he critiques the idols of science and technology and so forth, and shows the need to think Christianly as a countercultural voice to that. They didn't read Brueggemann at that point. Brian and his co-author Richard Middleton discovered Brueggemann. I don't know if I had anything to do with that or not. I'm not going to say. But they started reading Brueggemann after Transforming Vision. And the following book, which was an analysis of the postmodern culture, it's called Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be. The deconstructionists critiquing the meta-narratives and say, no, we need a meta-narrative, but the meta-narrative that we have is a counter to the power and prestige of the American dream and the Enlightenment Project. We have a story where the author of the story dies. And it's full of pathos and lament. And that's the way to reach postmoderns. And they use in the whole second half of the book, the scholarship of the book. And from that point on, Brian and Richard both become sort of modern, contemporary, evangelical champions of Brueggemann's work. It used to be only denominational people knew him, Lutherans and Episcopalians. And in recent years, it's evangelicals that are really appreciating him immensely. And I think part of that is the way Brian and Richard championed his work early on. Can I tell you another just a little quick story about that? Richard Middleton, who we, the CCO, know and esteem, he's spoken at Jubilee and stuff, once wrote an article in the Harvard Divinity School Theological Journal, one of the top scholarly journals in the world, critiquing a certain thing that Brueggemann said. I thought this was audacious, that this guy that wrote Transforming Vision, Truth is Stranger Than It Used to Be, it's before he had written any of his own books, but he had written these little books to Brian Walsh, was writing in this academic journal, critiquing, as nobody would do in those days, the nuances of Brueggemann on something. And wouldn't you know, Brueggemann loved the article. They asked him to write a reply, and he said, "You're mostly right. I think you're on something." And the two of them became fast friends over that. I know Richard was a little nervous, like going after, as a young scholar, going after, this esteemed statesman of Old Testament stuff. And he took him to task, and Brueggemann said, "Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going to have to think about that. I don't even remember now what it was. I used to pass that article out." But that was sort of kind of cool that Richard himself became a fan and friend of Brueggemann, and you can see it in their books.
Yeah, it's encouraging when someone whose work we love and hold in high regard, you find out that they're, as a person, not just their work, but just as a person, that they're a great, loving, kind, humble kind of person as well. That's always encouraging. Well, it was obvious, probably to any of our listeners who are familiar with Brueggemann, we were obviously going to start with Prophetic Imagination, but we've got two more books to talk about. Before we started recording, I took a guess as to which two Byron might pick, and I whiffed on both of those, which just goes to show that there's a whole lot of books we could have chosen. But what's the next one that you did pick, Byron?
Well, I could have picked that Sabbath one that you mentioned, Sabbath as Resistance. Man, what a title that is. We keep Sabbath to resist the the cultural forces of consumer capitalism and so on. What a good book that is. And you were right. I almost picked that one, but I picked one instead that is one of my favorites. It is called Journey to the Common Good. Journey to the Common Good were lectures that Walter gave at Regent College, which is in British Columbia. Just wonderful evangelical biblical scholars, thoughtful people for graduate degrees, not to prepare for seminary, but just those that want to study the Bible or study culture or study vocation and work. Steve Garber taught there as a professor for a year or two. Regent is one of my favorite places, and they have one of the best bookstores in North America up at Regent in British Columbia. Well, these were lectures, again, an evangelical institution, maybe one of the first evangelical institutions that hosted Walter to come in. I listened to the tapes of those before this book came out. And the tapes, by the way, had some Regent scholars, Old Testament scholars, replying to him and then him responding to their critiques. So there was a little more discussion going on. It was fabulous. I listened to him 4 or 5 times over this whole set of weekend lectures. The book came out. It was one of my absolute favorites, Journey to the Common Good. After 9/11 is when this was given. I think it was maybe 2010. And again, Brueggemann sort of trying to understand where America was in those days, the rise of the militarization and the Patriot Act and stuff after 9/11, the security state, the perpetual wars in Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq. And he was really kind of coping with our time and speaking into that, very, very much trying to recover this notion of common good, to love the world, the missional impulse that many missional thinkers now take for granted, that was less so even 20 years ago, was hardly spoken, that we love the world for the world, that we are called out of the world in order to be sent back into the world. For God so loved the world, why don't we, Leonard Sweet sometimes says. Well, if we love the world, then we have to care about the common good. We have to care about the peace of the city, as Jeremiah would put it, where God has put us, even in our hard times. And so the essays in this book, The Journey of the Common Good, Faith, Anxiety, and the Practice of Neighborliness. So he's looking at faith, he's looking at the anxiety about the changing world, postmodernism, relativism, the wars, the Afghanistan stuff. How does all that work? And then secondly, the continuing subversion of alternative possibility. That's a really, really good chapter. And he goes from Sinai to what he calls current covenanting. We make covenant for the common good. We get that from our language of covenant in Sinai, the continuing subversion of alternative possibilities when we understand Sinai covenantal theology. And then the third chapter is from vision to imperative. Again, this is just almost poetic language he uses. From vision to imperative, it's the work of reconstruction. What do we actually do to rebuild the city, you think, after exile, when they're back and have to rebuild with Nehemiah and all that? So he's looking at three major talks, three major chapters with lots and lots of biblical texts, and this continuing subversion of the alternative possibilities of covenantal theology. This is a great book, Journey to the Common Good. It's out in what they call an updated edition, where he wrote a very long new chapter as a foreword a couple of years later. The first edition came out in 2010. The second one came out in 2021. Times had changed a bit, perhaps gotten worse. You had mentioned his prescient, prophetic insight about the culture. That was the way this book felt as well. So important in its time and more important now than ever. So they did a second edition of it. Just wanted to talk about Journey to the Common Good. And if you can track down, I don't know if they're online or anything, but if you can track down those audio tapes from Regent College, they're spectacular.
That's great. You've mentioned a few times his poetic language. Yeah, I just think spending so much of his life drenched in the poetic language of the prophets clearly seeped into the way that he writes, and it is good scholarly academic work, and yet is very readable, very approachable, and captivating in the language that he uses.
I did a book notes. You can Google it and find it, but it was a reader's guide to Walter Brueggemann. And I named some of his most accessible books, his collections of sermons. And near the end of his life, he was blogging a lot. They have collections of his blog essays, brilliant. And then there's this kind of mid-level commentaries, the sort of things we're talking about. And he has a few really academic things that are impenetrable to me. And I named those as well, 3 or 4 that are really dense. So he's written in a variety of ways, and these are the ones that are probably most important for most of us. Here's a third one that's part of a series they're doing. There's 4 of them now in this series that all look like this. They call them the Walter Brueggemann Library, and they are collections of his academic journal articles and chapters from books and some other essays kind of mixed together, sermons maybe. And so it's sort of like a greatest hits collection around a theme. They have one on lament in the Psalms. They have one on worship. They have one on what the good news is. So they'll take his essays, some that are chapters from books, some that are hardly known because they're in academic journals and you wouldn't, most of us, know about them. And they pull those together as sort of a reader, a Walter Brueggemann Library reader. And I picked this one, Hope Restored, as maybe one of the great books to understanding the Bible. The subtitle is The Biblical Imagination Against Empire, against the forces of the empire, of the worldly powers that Jesus disarmed in Colossians 2, disarming the political powers, the magistrates and demonic rulers of the empire. So he looks at how a biblical imagination is formed to give us this countercultural prophetic imagination. And they have a bunch of his essays and sermons and articles grouped. I'll just walk you through real quick the chapters here. The first one is called Interesting Biblical Hope, because that's the theme of this book. How does this prophetic imagination lead to bona fide hope that God's kingdom is coming and we can be people of joy and real hope and embody that in our churches? The interesting hope, he has the literature of hope in the Bible and what it means to live towards that kind of vision. That was one of his early books, was Living Towards a Vision. It was on shalom in the Bible, living towards a vision. So he has some excerpts of that, the first 15, 20 pages. Then part 2 is the Torah, hope in promises and expectations. People expected the promises to be fulfilled. So we have this open-ended hope in Torah. And he looks at Torah and God's promises. He looks at how to preach about that, some exegetical and homiletical insights, how to understand the Bible, how to preach the Bible around the theme of hope in the Torah. Then the next part is the prophets, hope for restoration. And he looks at a chapter called Deep Memories, Passionate Convictions, and New Hopes. That's how he describes the prophets. And then what the end of Isaiah is about is the next chapter. It's called Hope for Well-Being, in the second and third parts of Isaiah. And again, exegetical and homiletical focus. In other words, how you understand these texts in their canonical context, in their exegetical setting, in their socio-political world, northern Israel or southern Israel before or after the exile. You have to know that stuff. And then how do you preach that? So that's his bit on the prophets, deep memories and passionate convictions. And then the third part is the writings, hope for transformation. So he goes from hope and promises to hope for restoration to hope of transformation. And he looks at Daniel here. He looks at God's future that's grounded in holiness in Daniel 1. And then he has a chapter called The Nagging Hope of Lament Psalms. He's done a lot on the lament psalms. And this is just one great chapter, again, exegetical and homiletical focuses on how you talk about and understand the Psalms of Lament. And then the conclusion is called Embracing the Transformation, a comment on what he calls missionary preaching, by which, of course, he means missional in our own secularized culture, not left or right, but understanding the ways in which science and technology has reduced all of life to mere data, and how our churches just have to offer a better, more artistic, imaginative alternative to the reductionisms of our culture. And that's where real hope can come, if we can transform the present moment by embracing the hope of the gospel. So this is the way he sort of understands hope in the Old Testament, with lots of practical stuff, but some good biblical exegesis as well. They dip from some of his books that you've heard of and a few articles you haven't heard of. And so it's a nice way to kind of discover in real quick ways some of the dense, serious, poetic stuff of Walter Brueggemann. It's not easy reads. This is not Max Lucado. It is complex. It is nuanced. It takes a couple of hours to get into it, because you really have to kind of follow his themes and his cadences and his vocabulary. But once you do it, I am convinced it'll be transforming for you.
Wow, so much here. This is one of our longest episodes for sure, but fittingly so, because there's so much to say about Walter Brueggemann, about his work, about these 3 books, and so many more. Like I said earlier, we could have talked about. I was really saddened to hear last week or 2 weeks ago when folks are listening to this that Brueggemann had passed away. But it's also been just really encouraging seeing all of the tributes to his life and work and the things that folks have shared online and in conversations about how meaningful his work has been to particular folks, to other scholars and writers and thinkers, and what an honor and a joy to get to contribute to that conversation today. So I'm grateful for this opportunity. So thank you so much for listening. As always, we want to remind you that you can get 20% off of all the books you order from this episode. To place an order, the link is it's the first link in the episode description. So check that out. Order these or other books by Brueggemann. Make sure to like and share this episode. We'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to Byron or to myself if you're reading these books or you're just part of this conversation about Brueggemann's life and work. We'd love to hear from you and dialogue with you. So feel free to reach out. We'd love that. So for Byron, Hearts and Minds Books, and the CCO, this has been another episode of the 3 Books from Hearts and Minds podcast. Thanks so much.